long journey comes to an end. Krakow and Warsaw and Lublin seem a long way from Pahiatua. Only a few miles now of all the thousands they've traveled to find a home.
We got on the train, and of course we started then our trip to Pahiatua.
The train takes them on the last leg of a long journey to Pahiatua camp, where they're to stay for a time.
I don't know how long it took, but it took much, much longer than it usually would take, because at almost every station the train would slow down, and we would be met by lines upon lines of young children and adults waving flags, waving flowers, giving us sweets, and so forth. And this tremendous feeling of being welcomed, I think it was almost contagious.
Just as they did 80 years ago today, residents of Pahiatua lined the lower North Island town's streets to bid a special and emotional tribute to a group of people forever known as the Polish children.
95-year-old Stefan Wowski, who now lives in Wellington, couldn't say no to returning to Pahiatua.
That's out of this world. How wonderful. I almost felt crying like that.
I can see you've got tears in your eyes, yeah.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It brings memories. Of course, we're different 80 years ago.
Like all the other Polish refugee children, I was very excited. Prime Minister Peter Fraser, who had invited us to New Zealand, came aboard the ship. There were speeches, and we were given sweets by kind ladies, and then we were taken in the train to our camp at Pahiatua.
My name is Vitold Pahiatua.
How did you find the drive into town just now?
Very overwhelming. Very open. It's very emotional. Let's put it that way.
Hi, I'm Alexia Russell, and this is The Detail. If you've ever taken a stroll along Wellington's waterfront, you've probably seen the little plaque that tells the story of the Polish children of Pahiatua. On the 31st of October 1944, 733 Polish refugee children and 105 adult caregivers sailed into Wellington Harbour on the USS General Randall. On the 1st of November, they settled in the Polish children's camp in Pahiatua. Their stories are incredible. And 80 years later, last weekend, many of the surviving children returned to Pahiatua, the town laying out the welcome mat as it did all those years ago. Journalist Peter Bale wrote the listener's cover story on this, and he was there too.
Pahiatua was pretty amazing. Every shop had Polish flags. Each window had a story of one of the kids written in it. I mean, the Pahiatua community really went behind it. The Tararua College there put on an absolutely extraordinary display of, and there was a little girl with a Pakeha father and a Korean mother sang in Polish the Polish national anthem, and there really wasn't a dry eye in the house. But the whole of the people down there, there's a woman who runs the local museum, Gilda McKnight, really put the whole thing together, and the community very much came behind it. But it wasn't just, it was a modern celebration as well as a celebration of these elderly people. All of their kids there. There were Polish families from the States who came, all wearing T-shirts with the names of their Polish Pahiatua relatives on them. All sorts of mad things were going on. The reason I went to Pahiatua was partly because I had interviewed a particular one of these Polish children, Mike Markowski, who is 92.
92, but forever a Polish child.
He is always a Polish child, and he is a dude. He is an extraordinary, tough, heavily mustachioed Polish man with absolutely photographic recollection almost of this extraordinary life. And I tried to make this point in the story I did for the listener. And this is not to diminish any of the other stories of the Holocaust or of the Second World War, but we know many of those stories through movies and books. Very few people know about the saga of these Polish kids, let alone the saga actually of the Polish Free Army, of which they were connected.
These little people have been wandering for nearly 5 years. They're broken pieces of once peaceful communities. They're remnants of families. These are the people war uproots and casts aside.
I've known about the Pahiatua Poles for a long time, but I discovered through the process of thinking about this story, or was triggered in a sense, by the discovery that my own grandmother looked after some of the Polish kids after 1944 at Pahiatua, but also set up a thing called the Polish Army League with another woman in Palmerston North in the early 1940s, Anne Jakes. And it ended up being a really powerful sort of individual and very personal commitment that they made to Polish soldiers who, of course, were fighting with New Zealand soldiers and British soldiers in places that we still have in our minds, like Tobruk, El Alamein, all of North Africa, really, and then, of course, Monte Casino.
The surviving fathers, now in uniform supplied by Britain, were fast becoming soldiers. They were to forge a link with New Zealand even before their children, when they fought with the 5th Army on the right flank of the New Zealand soldiers at Casino, scrambling across the vicious peaks behind the monastery. When the smoke of battle finally cleared, Polish casualties had been heavy. Many of the children's fathers lay on the slopes of Monte Casino.
And there was a great sense then, I think, after the invasion in 1939, that the Poles were incredibly plucky, warranted our support, and were up against a hellish situation, because in 1939, of course, they were invaded not just by the Nazis, but by the Soviet Union as well, under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Stalin and Hitler.
By the terms of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Agreement, Poland was divided and occupied by 2 foreign powers. The East, where the children came from, was under Russian control.
But in 1939, September the 19th, I think it was, Mr. Markowski said, NKVD, what became the KGB, knocked on the door in the middle of the night and said to his father, Polycarp, and his mother, Helena, and his sister, Stasia, that they were all to be deported. And this was the term that was used. They were deported from their own homes in Poland, their own village in Poland. These guys were taken on their own sleds in the snow, some distance to railway sidings where they were put into cattle cars, and trains were all connected, and they went off to Siberia. And when we say just went off to Siberia, there was an estimate between 1 million and 1.7 million Poles were taken in 1 or 2 or 3 waves of these deportations over a very short period. But Mike was taken on, let's just say, 19th of September. They ended up spread right across what we now think of as the Gulag. I think Mike was 9 at this time. They were sent to a camp in Arkhangelsk. And as he said, there weren't even any fences or walls. There didn't have to be, because there was nowhere to go. Yeah. You would have walked out and died. And he describes some pretty horrible, the father was more or less worked to death, working in timber. Mike describes in extraordinary detail the day his father died. It sounds like he more or less had a brain aneurysm of some sort after being worked to death in the forests. But Mike also describes at a springtime or in summer, he could walk out into the taiga, into the forest, and find berries and things to supplement the very, very meagre rations that he and his sister Stasia had to eat.
In June 1941, Germany attacked Russia, and the whole picture dramatically changed. Russia was now aligned with the Western powers. An agreement was signed between Stalin and General Sikorski, Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile, and the Poles suddenly found they were free.
And so my mother took us, and we started going to left Siberia and went all the way to Uzbekistan. So mother took us all the way down there. We had to walk and catch trains and that.
This is 92-year-old Mike Markowski, recorded by Peter over the reunion weekend, recalling the flight out of Russia.
The exodus started. Spilling out of concentration camps and mines, forests and labour camps, they streamed in their thousands across the face of Russia, men, women and children. The men headed towards Buzuluk, where they assembled in groups eager to join the Polish army, which was quickly being formed.
And they were all started going to Persia, Iran. And so my mother took us. We walked three days to get to Krasnovodsk. That's a port on the Caspian Sea. And from there, we went to Persia, Pahlavi.
So Mrs. Markowski, or Markowska, became aware that there was this movement of people, and she walked for 3 days with her by then 11-year-old boy and I think 9-year-old girl, Stasia, walked to a port on the Caspian Sea, and they wouldn't let her on, but they'd let the kids on.
Oh, no.
She had to go back to work in the fields. And Mike, this is when he did, literally touch his eye, the corner of his eye. And, he said, that was the last time I saw her. She turned around and she wasn't very well. And I'm not, Mike would say, I'm not sure she lived much longer after that. And they've never found where she, Mike and his children have tracked many of these parts of the journey. They haven't found her body or recognition of her life.
Thousands were permitted to stay in Persia for 2 years. when they had to disperse in groups to countries in both the east and the west. Fraser treated them well, and in time the faces of the children were as sunny as the climate. It was from here that the children came on to New Zealand.
Joe Yagawa remembers sailing into Wellington Harbour as a 9-year-old in late October 1944 after a couple of years in Persia, modern-day Iran. It was more than 4 years since his family were forcibly evicted from their home, and he arrived in New Zealand without any relatives.
We thought, what a lovely country. After being in Iran, everything's so dreary and dry. In those days, there was hardly any colour. And we come to New Zealand, everything's nice and green. And the big thing is the colours. I remember coming into the harbour and we all looked at all the beautiful little houses all stuck up on the hillside, all different colours.
I didn't really know about it until I happened to be on the Wellington waterfront. Of course, there's a plaque there that speaks of them.
I think that plaque was possibly my first indication of that as well. And the plaque is remarkably poignant because it talks about the contribution that New Zealand made, but it also talks about the contribution that the wartime Prime Minister Peter Fraser and his wife Janet made. And it's pretty clear that none of these kids would have been taken in by New Zealand without Janet Fraser being personally moved by the plight of these kids. So as I understand it, there's mixed stories here, but as I understand it, another group of Polish kids came to New Zealand briefly to take on supplies in Wellington on their way to Mexico. And the Polish ambassadress went on board and described the conditions, came back, talked to Janet Fraser, and essentially Janet Fraser said to Peter, we really have to look up, we can't let more of these kids, just go somewhere else. We need to find them a place in New Zealand. And he was persuaded to extend an invitation to another group of children, and so they were given effectively sanctuary. Now, interestingly, Peter Fraser's invitation was an invitation to stay until the end of the war rather than be permanently settled as refugees.
Why was that? Because was there a certain resistance from New Zealanders about this?
Yeah, I think there was great political sensitivity already had been, of course, with potentially bringing in Jewish people from Central Europe. New Zealand took in about 1,000 people between 1933 and 43, most of them from Central Europe, some of them Jewish, but not as many as we probably ought to have taken. And we weirdly had a preference for Czech people because they were believed to be more likely to integrate into our society. I mean, there was a tremendous bias towards good, upstanding white British people who we understood and knew. In the research for this, I came across some very interesting information from a historian that the Orange Order, the Protestant Orange Order in New Zealand, had objected to bringing in Catholic refugees, which is not unexpected, but it just shows you that there were sectarian divides in New Zealand that we don't often talk about. And so, yes, there was concern about non-British refugees coming to New Zealand, but also I think there was a hope that Poland would at some point be able to take its people back, particularly the kids back. The Poles, in fact, I think in 1945, at the end of the war, sent the Polish communist puppet government from Moscow, that was a puppet of Moscow, sent a representative to New Zealand to see the Pahiatua kids and insist that they be brought back. And Peter Fraser said, I don't think so. They don't want to go back. There's nothing for them to go back to in your country.
And he wasn't coming here and producing parents or anything
Correct.
like that.
And so we extended a permanent refuge to them.
All right, so they arrive on the ship in Wellington. What happens next? Because they reenact this train journey, so tell me about that.
They did. Well, it's a really... There is people can go online and do a very easy search for it. There's an absolutely wonderful National Film Unit, propaganda, documentary, newsreel, because those were the days when we would go to the movies a couple of times a week, perhaps to look at newsreels. And it's clearly, genuinely a joyous occasion.
For the Poles, there are no relatives or acquaintances, but there are many friendly faces. New Zealanders who've heard so much of the sufferings in war areas are eager to welcome and be kind to those who know firsthand what war suffering means. It's a big job to transfer 725 children and 113 adults to 2 trains for the last stage of their journey. Number tags tied on coats help to get over language difficulties, and smiles and friendly hands do the rest.
The kids are daunted but relieved. They clearly had... because they'd come pretty much from Bombay, I think, with the New Zealand soldiers, because the kids had come from Iran, gone and sort of assembled as a group in Bombay, and then joined the Randall to come to New Zealand with a whole bunch of New Zealand service people who were obviously desperate to get back. And so these kids, somebody said to me, they weren't photogenic. They were, they'd had a terrible life. They were absolutely adorable little critters. They were urchins. The boys were all shaven-headed. They'd been in camps where there were lice and all that sort of stuff. But they were adorable 9, 10, 11-year-olds, 3-year-olds. They also brought about, I think it's about 120 carers with them, some of whom were related. There were kids amongst the Pahiatua Poles who came with certainly one parent. Yeah. In many cases, in their refugee journey across the Soviet Union, they lost 1, 2, or all their families. So not all of them were in fact orphans. But the scene in Wellington, clearly in the newsreel, was of real delight. And then there was this extraordinary train trip from Wellington to Pahiatua. And I believe that at that stage the railway line more or less ran through Palmerston North. And there were hundreds, literally hundreds, if not thousands of people lined up with New Zealand flags and Polish flags and comics and ice creams, handing them through the windows.
Palmerston North seems to regard the event as a good reason for a long lunch hour and packing the station and standing by the railway line through the square to make a welcome for our guests. Many bring flowers and sweets and ice cream.
And really, people really embraced the idea of these kids, the story of suffering. They had experienced through 4 years of absolute hell, almost unimaginable hell. And if you listen to people like Mr. Markowski now, his recall is extraordinary, but it is almost unimaginable. The knock on the door at night and then being hauled out of your bed, being taken on a sled, on your own sled in some cases through the snow to a railway siding and then put into cattle cars and sent to Siberia. These kids had already been through hell, let alone living for, in many cases, 2 years in Iran, in dusty, difficult camps, and watching many of their colleagues die of things like malnutrition, disease. Yeah,
but yet they were sent to a camp.
When we turned up, all the adults started performing that, what's going on? Why are we being locked up in a prison? Yes, it had towers and big drains and it was a proper prison. Then because it was explained to us, look, it says, we're going to pull it all down and we'll never close the gate.
The history of the camp is actually extremely interesting as well. I mean, the thing is, you scratch the surface of our history a little bit, as you know, and you go a little bit deeper, or you find things that are not entirely tickety-boo, shall we say. So that camp already existed at Pahiatua. It was a military camp, but it had been used to intern Japanese New Zealanders, Japanese prisoners of war, German Samoan New Zealanders, or German Samoans, and various groups of sort of suspicious foreigners had been interned there during the war, locked up in the camps.
So the camp was empty.
The camp was empty, and they made a very clear. They were welcomed. They were put on army trucks and driven from Pahiatua railway station, which we followed the same route the other day with hundreds of adorable little Pahiatua kids waving "Welcome home" and Polish flags. And I can tell you, the older Polish people. Well, I was moved, and I'm not even Polish, but the elderly survivors of the Polish kids were just overwhelmed and stunned by it. And as I was going past, a man was calling out, "I was here in 44 to welcome you, and I'm still here."
Wow.
It means a lot, I think, actually, to those people in Manawatu Whanganui, in Pahiatua.
Right, so they have adopted this.
Oh, they're absolutely adopted it. Pahiatua is twinned with a city in Poland as a result of this, and many, many Poles to this day know, weirdly, about Pahiatua. Wow. But the camp was very welcoming. All the streets were renamed after Polish cities or after General Sikorski, for example, the wartime leader of the Polish Free Army. The Catholic Church was also very big in looking after them. There were the two Catholic archbishops at the time spent quite a bit of time at the camp. They went on picnics and they went on trips to stay with New Zealand families on farms around the country.
We went to Magatanoka School. In the Magatanoka School, the people were lovely to us, and all the children invited us for the weekends. So we had all the weekends we had to go to different places, stay weekends and enjoy English hospitality or New Zealand hospitality. And I think that improved our English a lot because we could communicate with people.
Some of them ended up going back to those families and being fostered or working for them after the war. They stayed until about 49. The camp was open until about 1949. Very young single kids at that time. Some of them were sent to convents or other Catholic institutions, mainly in Wellington, some in Wanganui. 90% of the Polish kids ended up staying in New Zealand and living in New Zealand and having families in New Zealand. I'm sure it wasn't all bucolic happiness.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, usually when you talk about kids being sent to an institution or a camp, you think abuse. That's the first word that comes to your head. But as far as we know, there wasn't that going on.
I haven't been able to scratch that particular itch. I think about it all the time. I am sure that there are kids who did not have such a good time. I'm aware, but I didn't do deep research on it, that some of the single kids who ended up in particularly girls who ended up in institutions run by the Catholic Church in Wellington did not necessarily have the optimal outcome. But I have yet to come across indications of abuse, but I haven't gone deeply looking for it. I would like to, actually.
And some went home, about 10%.
Well, some did go home. There was also, New Zealand took in around 200 Polish servicemen from the Polish Free Army who had proven family connections to these kids. So there were unifications, there were distant relatives and close relatives, and some of the kids, of course, married each other, and went off and stayed in New Zealand. I mean, when they left Iran to come to somewhere called New Zealand, they thought, oh my God, that's even further from Poland. It's even further from home. How are we ever going to get back? Will we ever see our parents again? Will we ever see our village again? And so they were really, particularly after the communist regime took over in 44, 45, they really didn't have a place to go back. Poland was divided. Poland had also been flattened, as we know, two armies marching across it. There was very little to go back to. And, many of those Polish Free Army soldiers absolutely could not go back either way. They would have been killed by the security police in Poland.
You become sort of self-sufficient. You know how to look after yourself. You don't sit and moan and say, why did it happen to me? You try and figure out how to get it out of it. That's why we survived, because it was built into our system, that survival.
Every one of those kids has the most extraordinary story. I chose to make Mr. Markowski the spine of my story because his story was so beautifully told, so typical in a way, which is not to diminish either his story or anybody else's. But I did, of course, ask him about PTSD. Did he ever have any treatment for PTSD or stress or trauma? He said we just had to get on with it, and he most certainly got on with it. He became a tram driver in Wellington, met Margaret Moriarty, who was a ticket clipper or a ticket seller on the trams. He then learnt to drive buses because they changed from trams. And then he and she went on to have 10 children. And he just seems to have been absolutely determined to get on with life.
And 7 of Mike's 10 children were at the reunion at the weekend, some of them after hearing his full story for the first time. That's nearly it for today, but Peter Bale has a final thought on our attitude today towards modern refugees.
One of the interesting aspects about this story from me, how do we treat refugees now? Do we have hundreds of people waving Myanmar flags or Tunisian flags or Somali flags for kids coming in? I don't know. I mean, and of course there are families and we bring them in a different way. But, there's a reason that the Mangere Asylum Centre has a fence around it, and it's not to keep them in. Maybe we just think of the Second World War as the last kind of righteous conflict, if you like, where we knew who was right and who was wrong and that we were on the good guy's side.
The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Amanda Gillies. Thanks to Peter Bale. I'm Alexia Russell. Do widzenia.
They can dream in peace, for this is a home. This is the end of their journeying.